codes of practice, things like reef protection markers. So again, different tools to manage, in this case, tourism. Here's another one, defence. This is a defence training area that for most days of the year doesn't even exist. As a boater, you can go right through that area for about 300 days a year, or more than that. But for a very small time of the year, that area is totally closed to everyone while they conduct defence activities. So I'm just trying to stress all these different layers of management. If you put them into one single layer of zoning, it would be too complex. But what we've managed to have is almost three-dimensional management, and only different sectors need to know what management applies to them. The other thing that's important is that we are managing in an environment that is always changing. The use patterns are changing. Today, the number of people living adjacent to the reef is much greater than it was 20 years ago. Huge change in technology. The way people access and use the reef, things like the jet skis, very different. Huge economic changes. The way that people spend their money on recreation today is very different from what it was 20 years ago. Political change and also the fact that we're managing a very dynamic system. So as managers, we need to have a very much an adaptive management approach. We can't just manage for the past, we have to think for the future and certainly recognise these areas are changing. What I want to spend a little time on is one of the approaches in the Great Barrier Reef that we've been adaptive. We've just been recently required by law to produce a report called the Outlook Report. The big report is this big one, and the little one called In Brief was the one written specifically from the Minister, the short version. But this was a very effective report, requirement by law. What the law actually says, we have to do 8 assessments. 3 assessments relate to values. We're required to assess the biodiversity, to assess the health of the ecosystem, to assess the commercial and non-commercial use. We're also required to assess pressures and responses. So what are the factors influencing the reef? What's the protection and management? In other words, the management effectiveness. What's the resilience of the ecosystem? And the risks. And then we're required to take all those previous assessments to come up and give a long-term outlook. What's the future of the Great Barrier Reef? So when we started developing this, we had really no idea what it was going to look like. It's actually been an incredibly useful report. One of the key aspects was to look at the different risks. And this is your classic risk matrix, where across the top you've got increasing likelihood, and up the side, increasing consequence. I won't expect you to read the small print, but effectively, in those 41 key risks, a huge number relate to climate change. So in that top right corner, the red, we've got things like acidification, increasing sea temperature, increasing sea level. We've got a number of issues relating to water quality. Again, things like increasing nutrients, increasing pesticides, increase from those things in diseases. So water quality is it's probably our second biggest threat. A large number of the risks relate to impacts from fishing, whether we're fishing top order predators, whether we're having bycatch issues, all those sorts of issues came in from the report. The last key one, and there were lots of different priority issues, but the last of the 4 key was the loss of coastal habitats. Again, primarily from coastal development, things like impacts on longshore currents, impacts on downstream water flows, etc. So that report effectively looked at a number of key risks and ranked them. And then the overall outlook at the end of the report effectively said this: the outlook for the Great Barrier Reef is at a crossroad. Unavoidably, future predictions of climate change dominate most aspects of the Great Barrier Reef's outlook. So people were amazed. As a government agency, and with the endorsement of the government, we came out and we said the future assessment of the Great Barrier Reef is poor. That's the final conclusion of this report. But that has been really very effective for us. It was written in a simple way for the Minister to understand, and he can now use that to go to Cabinet and argue for here is a resource worth $5 billion to the Australian economy, and the outlook, mainly due to things beyond our control, climate change, water quality, those sorts of things, the future is, outlook is poor. Another aspect of the report that I'd like to spend a bit of time on was the one about looking at management effectiveness. This chapter in the report was one that we hadn't really looked at before, and we got some expert advice to help us. To cut a very long and complex story short, the experts who came from outside told us to look not just at the outcomes, so are we not just being effective in our outcomes, but as those 6 components of management effectiveness show. You can have a good outcome from either good management or good luck. So you need to look at whether your inputs are important or working, your planning, your processes, your outputs and your outcomes, and starting off with your context. So we applied that model of management effectiveness to 12 key topics in the Great Barrier Reef. Some of them about values like biodiversity and heritage, some of them about threats, water quality and climate change, and some of them about use. So we chose 12 key topics and we applied those 6 elements of effectiveness. And what it showed us was a number of things we weren't even expecting ourselves. This is down the left-hand side, the 12 elements of management, and across the top, the components of effectiveness. And the one that was a real eye-opener was coastal development. You can see there that planning was rated as poor. And when this came out, people said, how can this be? We have so many plans for coastal